This is part 2 of Chapter 5, Socialism through Marx in the Political Ideologies class. We've already talked about the origins of socialism and Marx's theory of history. So let's talk about Marx's views on capitalism. Interestingly enough, he has some pretty positive things to say about capitalism at first, in that it served a progressive function. It, as we've already talked about in our lecture on the formation of the state, it actually contributed to the demise of the feudal period in that area between 1300 and 1500 that we talked about. It motivated the creation of trade routes for other resources such as tea, silk, and spices. And as we also talked about in that previous lecture, the kings found themselves in debt to the merchant capitalists, so this helped to take away more power from the noble class, the noble landowners, so that it served some progressive functions at first. The bourgeoisie, as we talked about in the last lecture in part 1, that is the elite owning class or property owning class. They use this concept to resolve their personal worth into an exchange value and to pursue free trade. So capitalism was initially a progressive force in making humans masters over nature in order to improve our survival through colossal productive forces. Capitalism was also progressive in its need for innovation and change, motivating that through constantly revolutionizing the forces of production. So then that would bring up an obvious question: why so critical of capitalism? So I'll talk about 4 basic reasons here as to Marx's critique of capitalism. First one is that at the time he felt like capitalism was already outmoded. It had served its function and prepared the way for a higher and freer form of society. So according to this progression of change in history that he'd picked up on from Hegel, he felt like that this was just part of the process, that this was ready to move on to the next phase. Also, he talked about that capitalism creates what he refers to as a process of alienation for the worker. The workers are alienated from their work because it's a rather repetitive, non-intellectual type function. They're also alienated from each other if they're just doing repetitive type work. And interestingly enough, this was one of Adam Smith's big critiques as far as why the government needed to provide public education, because the worker would not get it from this type of labor. So the government would then have to provide education to fill that void in the worker. So we see some commonalities here as far as this alienation concept goes. The workers are put into a position to where they're forced to sell their labor at the cheapest price that the owners would be willing to and able to pay, and that mass production kills their creative spirit, and they become somewhat of an appendage of the machine. This power that humans tend to crave is that the power to create and enjoy beauty of the world is dulled. Another critique is that capitalism reduces work to a mere necessity rather than to a craftsman or an art form or to a personal motivation. Workers are made to compete for jobs, therefore driving down wages. And also looks at it from the other point of view, that capitalists themselves are also appendages to the capital, their assets, their property that becomes their master. And he makes the note that if more money can be made investing abroad and moving jobs elsewhere, then it would be rational to do that. And as I've said before, all of these critiques that Marx makes of capitalism still hold up today. It is still a concern that we have to deal with in our capitalist society. Perhaps even more relevant today than it was back then is that capitalists, particularly the multinational corporate interests, technically have no fatherland. We've seen several examples of where multinational corporations have jumped ship because of looking for better benefits or lower corporate taxes in other countries. Apple, for example, has relocated their business headquarters to Ireland in order to pay a fraction of the corporate tax that they would pay if they were here, even with tax breaks. Obviously, the way the system is designed is that it's perfectly rational to do that because we want to increase our profits, improve our benefits. Another critique is that capitalism is what he calls self-subverting, and that this iron logic that we're socialized into constrains the actions of everyone because this is the system of how it's supposed to work. Wages are kept low because the system requires it. He gives an example here. Let's just say there's an owner who wants to give his workers better wages. So he raises wages. He actually shortens the workday. He improves conditions. However, the competitor to this particular owner here does not do that. So what could potentially happen? Well, those improvements that this owner makes have to be paid for, and that raises costs of production in order to do that. These raised prices, therefore, drives away consumers because the competitor is still able to have lower prices. So therefore, those customers could potentially be driven away to the competitor. And the reduction in profit in order to provide these benefits for the workers drives away investors. So that's kind of a lose-lose situation when that owner does that, and potentially could become bankrupt as a result, while the competitor therefore grows larger. And that's one of the rational motivations of our capitalist system, is for companies to get bigger because of the economies of scale and to be able to create that next product out there on the margins cheaper and cheaper and cheaper because you have more productive forces able to do that. So we have tendency in our capitalist system towards monopolies. So those are the basic summarized critiques of capitalism. So what was Marx's dialectic of change? What was his prediction here as to what's going to happen to capitalism and what's in store for the future? He's talking about how capitalists tend to exploit the worker by extracting surplus value from them, and that it's logically impossible for everyone to be a capitalist. So that's setting the stage for this change. The workers, therefore, then must realize that capitalists need them for this system to survive. The workers would not be able, it's almost like the master-slave dialectic, that both are socialized into these roles, and one role cannot exist without the other role. So Marx says that if that exploitation is eliminated, then you would eliminate the classes, the owner class versus the working class. Since the workers are the vast majority, the proletariat, the working class, would therefore become what he calls the universal class, and that would separate us from this concept of alienation from our work, and that each worker would then be able to develop their own potential to the fullest. Now, obviously, this is an idealist view, and there's clearly reasons why it has not come to fruition as he was predicting. This is the revolutionary sequence that he felt was ready to happen. Economic crises would be more frequent and severe. Yes, in a way they were. As we get into the late 1800s, there was more and more financial crises. This led, even in the United States, to considerable reforms, including the establishment of a central bank, or I guess I should say a reestablishment of the central bank. Also going to a gold standard, things like that. As these economic crises become more frequent and more severe, then he described the inescapable immiseration of the proletariat. Their lives was going to be very difficult. The fault lies with the system. So therefore, calling for an overthrow of the bourgeoisie, the owner class. Now, how does that happen? Well, there could be a few different ways that could happen. A nationwide general strike, which means all the workers, of course, would have to be united on that. Could even potentially happen through a civil war, which could get very bloody, or it could even be through ballots. He kind of leaves that open as to what might result in this overthrow. Then once the overthrow occurs, this is what he calls the next phase of this revolutionary sequence, the dictatorship of the proletariat, which means that once this overthrow has occurred, the proletariat need to use the forces, the existing forces of the state apparatus, in order to prevent the owner class or the bourgeoisie from regrouping. That would keep the overthrow intact while these other things are happening. And so this would then result in the withering away of this state apparatus eventually. First of all, wage incentives would have to be established to encourage people to work hard. So it's interesting how we have to use some of these same types of capitalist incentives in order to get this shifted back around. But it's also looking at it more of an idealistic perspective here, is that each person would work according to his ability, each according to his need. So everybody would just work as to what they needed to work, and they would pursue the work that was to the best of their ability. Again, that's not providing a whole lot of details of how that would be organized, but again, that's the general idea. And then eventually, once this transition has occurred and people are working the jobs that they want to work in and working according to their own need, then the population, this universal class, would realize that exploitation is not even needed. It's not necessary. And there's no need for any more coercion for this system to work. Therefore, this opens the door and allows for what Marx predicted, the ultimate goal of communism, where you would have a completely open and democratic system. I know this sounds ironic based on the results we've seen from communism, which we will talk about in more detail later on. But communism is, in theory, the ultimate form of pure democracy, where everybody is considered equal, everybody shares in the benefits equally. We know that has not panned out because there's really no two human beings in the entire world that are totally equal. So you start to see cracks in that system fairly early on, in that one person may be saying that, well, I actually contribute more to this society than that person does, but yet they're getting the same thing that I'm getting. So you can kind of see what some of the flaws may be fairly early on, and that's why I'll get to that here in a second, that every communist system has devolved very quickly into a single-party authoritarian system. The communist system, where all major means of production are publicly owned, again, that then you'd have to decide who is responsible for the planning and the distribution of goods based not on privilege or wealth, but on ability and need. But what we've also seen is that the people that are in charge of this become exploiters fairly quickly because they're the ones that are making the decisions to dole it out. The theory, of course, is that everyone has the freedom to become well-rounded Renaissance men. But what we have seen instead is that the people such as Lenin, then Stalin, then Mao, a few other examples, is that rather than giving everyone the freedom to become well-rounded Renaissance men, there was even more incentive to keep people ignorant in order to keep them as dependent upon the vanguard party, as it was called. Marx did say very little about the specifics of how this system would work. Even to this day, Marx's value has been more importantly on the critique of capitalism, what we still have to watch out for to this day, what are some of the things that we need to keep an eye on, perhaps some of the options for reform to make it work better for more people. Again, still very astute critique as far as that goes. But at the time, the idea was that he was resistant to sounding more utopian. And when you look at particularly the ideal concept of the communist system, that was pretty utopian in itself. So he was trying to avoid being any more utopian than he was. Now, what his system was used for after his death, Marx, again, we don't know for sure, but it did not pan out to what Marx had intended for it to be, and he would most likely have been very surprised, perhaps even astonished, at what his ideas were then transformed into. In some cases, maybe even appalled as to what came about as a result of these socialist theories and how they had been interpreted and used, or in some cases horribly misused, that resulted in the dictatorship of Stalin, which some of those policies resulted in millions of deaths of starvation, and then the National Socialist policies of Hitler that led to the very racist doctrines of fascism and Nazism that resulted in millions of deaths and a horrible world war. So this is probably what Marx is, I guess, as far as any criticisms of Marx, it would be that his ideas were used for these types of systems. However, that's probably not too fair on him when you consider what some other systems he has also inspired, social democratic systems that have been very successful, relatively speaking. So again, we have to take it in increments here as far as what the original ideas were, what were Marx's ideas, what were his theories, what were his predictions, then what came after it. All right, so this wraps up Chapter 5, Socialism through Marx. Chapter 6, we'll talk about socialism in more detail after Karl Marx.